You don't really know what you owe a person until you run out of ways to blame them. That truth arrived for me late, like a letter lost in a snowstorm and finally found in spring, creased, water-stained, and still legible enough to change you. I grew up in Asheville, North Carolina, where the Blue Ridge folds like patient hands around the town. My father, Robert Harris, was the kind of man the world passes by without a second look. A handyman, a fixer of little things, hinges, leaky pipes, porches that sagged like tired shoulders. He kept a small shop off Merriman Avenue with a sign he painted himself. Harris Repair and Odd Jobs. The ampersand looked like it had been coaxed into existence by someone who didn't believe in fancy letters. Just straight lines, honest curves, and paint that chipped politely only after years of rain. People say a town is just a map until you start walking it. Dad knew every street by the sound of its gravel. He knew which mailboxes leaned because a certain teenager had a heavy hand after his first breakup, and which screen doors squeaked in a way that meant the spring needed replacing. He kept notes on index cards, not because he forgot easily, but because he respected memory as a thing to be handled with both hands. He wrote slowly, "Mrs. Langley, back steps, watch the dog, friendly but anxious." I was not slow. I was everything the world claps for. On a roll, then a marketing degree, then a job where I could say words like activation and brand lift, and watch other people nod as if I were carrying a torch only I could see. I lived downtown by the river for a while, then moved with a boyfriend to a place with air that tasted like new drywall. On good days, I felt like a billboard that had finally found the right highway. On bad days, I thought of my father's hands, nicked, oil-stained and sure, and felt an irritation I mistook for wisdom. You measure success when you're young by reflections, by how big the water looks when you stand beside it. Dad measured success by what didn't break anymore, by what stayed standing. He never said much about the money. He wore the same boots until their soles smoothed into the shape of our town's hills. He kept a coffee tin above the fridge with a slit in the lid and the word tires written in black marker. Sometimes I'd see a folded 20 disappear into that tin and think, tires. Really, there were days when I believed life was a ladder, and my father had made a choice not to climb it. Choices are easy to judge when you never look at the wind. Asheville is green in the way you think only memories can be. Summers hum here. The cicadas play the same song every year, and the maples clap like old friends who don't need small talk. My father fit this place. He fit its slow, unglamorous kindness. I did not. I loved the town like you love the jacket you've outgrown but keep anyway. At the Sunday potlucks, people would clap Dad on the shoulder as if they shared a secret, and he'd nod with that shy half-smile that said he was fine with not telling it. "Robert fixed our porch," someone would say. "Refused to take full pay," another would add. The compliments made me fidgety. I wanted a resume I could print on thick paper and slide across a table with a practiced smile. I wanted Dad to have that too, as if dignity wore a tie. There is a small cruelty in the way we compare. It starts, I think, with love, how we want the people we belong to be bulletproof in public. My father gave me the gift of quiet reliability, and I rewrapped it as embarrassment. Once, after my boyfriend met Dad for the first time, he said, "Your old man's sweet, salt of the earth." His voice had that tilt people get when they believe they're being generous. We broke up a few months later for reasons that had nothing to do with my father and everything to do with me, but I still hear his tone when I remember those words. Sweet, salt of the earth. A pat on the head disguised as praise. I don't know the exact moment when love turned into an audit. Maybe it was the morning I found Dad's ledger on the kitchen table, the columns neat, the sums precise, the bottom line low. Maybe it was the day a neighbor praised him for mowing her lawn during her chemo, and I watched him brush off the compliment like dust, not even thinking to mention the gas money, the time, Or maybe it was the night I came home from a work event, new heels, old hunger, and found him sitting at the table with a broken toaster disassembled like a puzzle. "Cheaper to fix than replace," he said, and I laughed like a person who had forgotten the cost of things. We didn't fight much. That came later. Mostly we did what families do when they are learning to be strangers. We became polite. He'd ask about my job, and I'd narrate wins as if I were reading headlines. He'd tell me about a pipe he fixed under the church or a ramp he built for Mr. Alvarez after his stroke, and I'd smile in a way that meant, "Please say you raised your rates. Please say you finally asked for what you're worth." He didn't. He changed the subject to what I wanted to eat. When my mother left, I was 12. It isn't a big part of this story, not because it didn't matter, but because Dad never let her absence be the loudest thing in the house. He filled the quiet with routine. Mornings smelled like coffee and the lemon oil he used to wipe the table. Evenings sounded like the chuff of his boots by the door, the rattle of tools finding their shelves. He never spoke badly of her. He folded our life with careful corners and put it on the shelf where it wouldn't collect more dust than it had to. I have learned since that such restraint takes muscle you can't show off. My father taught me the kind of math that never makes it into textbooks, how to count the true cost of kindness, how to price a repair so that dignity is paid in both directions, how to calculate what a town owes to a man who keeps its hinges from squealing. I forgot those lessons the way you forget a lullaby, first by choice, then by habit, then by accident, until someone hums it and you cry without knowing why. The last summer before everything changed, I visited him on a Tuesday. The shop door stuck like it always did, and I shouldered it open. The bell above it jingled a tired little chime. Dad looked up from a lawn mower whose insides were splayed like a biology lesson. He smiled. "Hey, kiddo." He hadn't called me that in years. It fit and didn't. I was wearing a blazer. The heat was pushy and old, like a memory that wouldn't quit. He wiped his hands on a rag. There was a radio on the shelf murmuring a baseball game through a veil of static. The fan in the corner had a lazy rotation, as if it had made peace with sweat. I told him about the new campaign I'd pitched and how the client liked my slides. He nodded the way he nodded when someone told him a fence held after a storm. Proud, not of the fence, but of the comfort it kept. "Got any lunch plans?" he asked. "I have a call at 1, I said, glancing at my watch though I didn't need to. He had packed a paper bag with 2 sandwiches and a peach cut in half, wrapped in wax paper. He slid one across the counter toward me. A small ceremony. "Eat here, then," he said. "Your call's not for 30 minutes. You can love a person and still rush past them." We ate without hurrying. He asked questions that showed he listened. I asked fewer. My phone buzzed twice. The peach juice ran down our wrists and we laughed. I think of that now and understand that some holiness is sticky and simple. Before I left, he pressed 2 folded 20s into my palm. "For gas," he said. His hands were warm with the day's work. "Dad," I started, that teenage syllable creeping back into my voice. "Keep it," he said. "Sometimes it's about who gives, not what." On the way out, I noticed a stack of unpaid invoices, not his other people's, neighbors who would pay when they could or never. I touched the top edge of the pile as if the paper could feel my disapproval, and I heard myself say, "You can't run a business like this." He looked at me then, not defensive, not ashamed, just steady. "I'm not running a business," he said. "I'm keeping promises. If you are reading this looking for a villain, I can point you to a mirror. Mine was always clean. My apartment plants lived. My calendar had color-coded blocks that made me feel like a person executed efficiently. I knew the best coffee in town and the quickest back roads to the highway. I didn't know the price my father paid for being decent, and I didn't ask. There is a corner in every story where the map folds. You can feel it under your fingers, and not know yet that it will change the way you travel. For me, that corner was a Tuesday in late September when the air was learning again how to be crisp. I saw my father walking out of a grocery store with a woman I recognized from church, Melissa, the one whose husband had left in the kind of hurry that leaves you counting forks. Dad carried her bags to the car. He put a hand on her shoulder when she started to cry and stood there in the parking lot while the shadows of late afternoon lengthened like prayers that almost reached the ground. "Do you have to fix everybody's life?" I asked him that night. I didn't mean it to sound cruel, but care wears down the cane it leans on. He shrugged. "I don't fix lives," he said. "Just little things. Sometimes that's enough to get a life through the day." He had a way of making hard truths sound like simple instructions. People came to him for repairs and left with reasons to try again. I tell you this not to sanctify him. I know better now than to marble a man, but because the facts make more sense if you see the shape of his days. I wish I could say that this was where I turned toward him humbled, that I apologized and learned the vocabulary of gratitude before it was too late. But that is not how stubbornness works. Pride is a closed fist. It takes time to open. In my version of events back then, I was the one who could see the future clearly, and my father was a man who refused to keep up with it. I mistook anchor for anchor chain. The word I will one day say, the one that will echo longer than I can bear, wasn't on my tongue yet. It hovered, a storm that had not announced itself. In Chapter 1, this is what I want you to understand. People are not their resumes, and towns are not their skylines. We are held together by 1,000 small tightenings of the wrench. We are saved, when we are saved at all, by hands we don't bother to notice until they are gone. That night, I drove home along Riverside. The river wore the moon like a necklace, and the lights from the brewery district knocked softly on the water. I thought of my father counting out screws into a shallow tray, of the way he kept them sorted by size and hope. I thought of the index cards in his shirt pocket, the coffee tin above the fridge, the pile of invoices he might never collect from. I told myself I was worried for him. Maybe I was. Maybe worry is how love disguises itself when it's afraid to be tender. At a red light, I imagined him locking up the shop. Click, buzz, thunk, the choreography of ending a day. He would reset the radio to a station with fewer commercials, sweep the floor from the back to the front, and hang the rag on its nail. He would step into the dark as if it were a room he'd been in before. He would check his pockets, keys, wallet, cards. He would stand for a second under the sign with its sturdy, unfancy ampersand and look up at the sky the way a man looks at a ceiling and trusts that it will hold. If you're still listening, if you've subscribed to more than this channel, if you've subscribed to the idea that small lives matter, then hear me. The beginning of my story is not dramatic. It is the sound of a bell above a door. It is a sandwich halved, a peach shared, a 20 folded into a daughter's hand. It is a man who returns a borrowed ladder with the rungs cleaned, because he believes in returning things better than he found them. I once called my father a loser. The word will come soon, in a later chapter, and it will land like a hammer on a porcelain plate. But here, at the start, I need you to see what I failed to see. The way a town leans quietly toward the person who keeps it from falling apart. I need you to see the tenderness I mistook for lack. I need you to know that the ledger I mocked kept a different kind of accounting, the kind that towns settle not with checks, but with tears. Tomorrow, or the next day, I will get a call that changes everything. I will stand in a crowded room and hear story after story I should have known, and they will braid themselves into a rope strong enough to pull me back to the shore of the person I was meant to be. But for now, it is enough to tell you that I lived in the same town as a quiet lighthouse and never learned the pattern of its light. This is how a daughter fails a father in a place that taught her better. This is how pride chooses a mirror over a window. This is how a story begins, with a man who fixed little things and a woman who thought little of that. And if you're wondering what it costs to be wrong for that long, I can tell you, everything you haven't yet learned to love. I used to believe that childhood was a sketchbook you outgrew, pages torn out one by one until nothing was left but vague outlines. Only later did I realize the lines we dismiss are the ones that end up guiding every stroke that follows. When I think back now, the root of my shame and my father did not begin with the word loser I would one day fling at him. It began much earlier, in small humiliations no one else noticed, seeds that lay dormant until pride watered them into weeds. My earliest memories of Dad are not cinematic. There were no grand vacations, no photographs of us grinning beside Mickey Mouse or the Grand Canyon. Instead, there was the sound of his boots unlacing in the evening, the clink of his thermos against the sink, and the faint smell of sawdust trailing behind him like an invisible coat. He never came home empty-handed. Sometimes it was a half-eaten sandwich wrapped in wax paper, sometimes a broken hinge he wanted to fix for practice, sometimes a story about a neighbor who couldn't pay and promised to make it up when the harvest came in. He told these stories as if they were normal, as if life was a ledger where debts didn't matter as long as kindness kept the ink flowing. As a child, I adored him. When you are small, you don't measure worth in money, you measure it in presence. He was there, always there. He never missed a school play, even if he showed up in clothes spattered with paint, his hands smelling of turpentine. Once in 3rd grade, I forgot my lunch at home, and when I opened my lunchbox at noon, I found a peanut butter sandwich so hastily wrapped that the jelly leaked through. The other kids laughed. I laughed too, embarrassed. But I ate it anyway. At the time, I didn't know he had run 3 blocks from a job site during his lunch break just to bring it. Memory has a way of twisting like that. You only see the sacrifice after the shame has already scarred. By middle school, shame became a kind of shadow. My friends' fathers wore suits, carried briefcases, and spoke of meetings and conferences. Mine wore overalls, carried toolboxes, and spoke of patching roofs and fixing faucets. I remember sleepovers at houses where kitchens gleamed with granite countertops, where mothers served sodas in glasses instead of cans. Returning home to our faded laminate counters and second-hand furniture felt like stepping backward in time. I began to keep people at a distance, terrified they'd see the truth I carried like a birthmark, that my father was ordinary, too ordinary for a daughter who wanted the world to clap. Dad, of course, never noticed. Or maybe he did and chose to let it pass, the way he let storms pass, knowing roofs could be patched afterward. He cheered when I made the honor roll, when I scored goals on the soccer field, when I got my first part-time job at the coffee shop. He saved my pay stubs, tucked into an envelope marked Emily's firsts. Meanwhile, I saved nothing of his. If he brought home a story, I filed it under irrelevance. If he offered advice, I labeled it outdated. Love was still there, but it was being slowly painted over by pride's dull brush. High school sharpened the divide. I remember the day career day posters went up. Fathers and mothers with real jobs came to speak, lawyers, doctors, engineers. I asked Dad not to volunteer. He didn't even hesitate. "Of course, kiddo," he said with a smile. He never asked why. That night I heard him in the kitchen, humming while polishing his boots, as if polishing away the invitation he never received. I pretended to study in my room, guilt gnawing at me, but pride louder still. The next day, when my classmates asked what my father did, I lied. "He manages a small business," I said, which in a way wasn't untrue, but it wasn't the truth that mattered. There were deeper roots, too, the kind you don't notice until years later when you dig. My mother's leaving left holes that no plaster could fill. She was graceful, ambitious, restless. She wanted more than Asheville's slow mornings and quiet hills. I inherited her hunger, her embarrassment, though I never admitted it then. Dad, by contrast, was a man of staying. He stayed through the leaving. He stayed through the silences. He stayed when she called once from Florida and said, "Robert, you should move on." He didn't move on. He just kept moving forward, one step, one repair at a time. And in the cruel arithmetic of a teenage daughter, staying looked like stagnation. College was my great escape. I ran toward it with the speed of someone fleeing a burning house, though the house was never burning. It was just too plain for me. I chose a university hours away, not because it had the best program, but because distance was the measure of freedom. Dad drove me there in his old pickup, the muffler coughing like a smoker. He carried my boxes up 3 flights of stairs, sweat staining his back. My new roommate's parents arrived in a polished SUV, unloading sleek luggage while her father wore a polo shirt with a company logo embroidered neatly on the chest. I caught her mother staring at Dad's patched jeans. My face burned hotter than the August sun. When he left, he hugged me tight and whispered, "Proud of you, Em." I barely hugged back. I waved quickly, desperate for him to disappear before anyone else saw. That is the kind of cruelty you don't realize you're capable of until years later when you'd give anything to take it back. Those college years built the scaffolding of my arrogance. While Dad fixed roofs, I studied branding strategies. While he drove his dented truck, I learned about consumer psychology and market segmentation. I told myself I was transcending, climbing the ladder he had ignored. Phone calls home became brief. He'd ask how classes were going, I'd give clipped answers. He'd tell me about Mrs. Jensen's fence or the church's new wheelchair ramp. I'd change the subject. Love had turned into performance, his of quiet service, mine of loud ambition, and neither of us knew how to cross the stage to the other. The deeper truth, the gnarled root I couldn't name then, was fear. Fear that his life was my inheritance. Fear that staying meant shrinking. Fear that kindness without recognition was just weakness. I see now that those fears were not about him, but about me. But back then, I wore them like armor and used them like arrows. Pride is rarely honest. It usually hides the trembling underneath. One winter break, I came home to find Dad patching the roof despite the cold. Snow fell in lazy flakes, melting on his jacket. "Come inside," I pleaded. He shook his head. "Leaks don't wait for spring." I remember rolling my eyes, muttering something about how he could hire someone instead of always being the one to fix everything. He smiled, a little tired, and said, "If I can help, why wouldn't I?" That was his whole philosophy, boiled down to one sentence. At the time, I dismissed it. Now, I wish I had bottled it like medicine. By the time I graduated, the divide between us felt permanent. He sat proudly in the audience, clapping louder than anyone, though his shirt collar was frayed and his tie clearly borrowed. I avoided introducing him to my professors, terrified they would see what I saw, a man out of place in the world I was chasing. After the ceremony, he hugged me so fiercely I thought my ribs might crack. "You did it," he whispered. "You really did it." I smiled for the photographs, but inside I was already calculating how far I could move, how quickly I could build a life that didn't look like his. Looking back, I understand now that every root of resentment was twisted around a misunderstanding. He gave freely because he believed that was the highest form of wealth. I took freely because I believed success meant never needing anyone. He found dignity in fixing what was broken. I found shame in the fact that things broke at all. He loved the town enough to keep it together. I loved myself enough to leave it behind. And when paths split like that, it's only a matter of time before the words you fear most slip out. Loser. That word would come later, sharp as glass, cutting deeper than I ever intended. But it had been growing in the soil of these years, nourished by every comparison, every eye roll, every moment I chose pride over tenderness. This is the root, the origin story of my blindness. It wasn't one moment, but 1,000. Lunchboxes, sleepovers, career days, farewells, each one a thread pulled loose until the sweater of our bond hung in tatters. If you had asked me then, I would have said I was simply ambitious, that I was making something of myself. What I didn't see was that I was also unmaking something, a daughter who once saw her father as enough. When people say regret comes suddenly, they are wrong. Regret is a slow-growing vine. It wraps around your memories, tightening with each passing year, until one day you try to recall a moment without it and find that you cannot. Mine began here, in the years when I confused quiet goodness with failure. My father was teaching me how to measure a life, but I was too busy grading him on a scale the world had handed me. By the time I realized the exam was rigged, the teacher was gone, of missed calls. Asheville looked unchanged, like a photograph that refused to yellow, but I had changed. I walked the streets in high heels instead of sneakers, checked my phone constantly, and carried myself like someone who believed the city was too small to contain her. Dad, of course, carried himself as he always had, shoulders bent slightly from work, eyes softened by kindness. It infuriated me, though I couldn't have said why. The tension built in increments. He asked if I wanted to help in the shop. I declined, claiming deadlines. He suggested a walk by the river. I rolled my eyes, too tired. He cooked dinner, the same meatloaf he had made 100 times before, and I complained about the lack of variety. He laughed it off, but I saw the flicker in his eyes, like a candle suddenly aware of the draft. I mistook his patience for weakness. I mistook his silence for surrender. Pride is a cruel interpreter. The night it happened, we were sitting at the kitchen table, the one that had borne every homework assignment, every bill, every dinner since I was a child. The table had scratches from years of forks and pencils, but it was sturdy like him. I had just come back from a dinner with friends from college who were visiting town. They spoke of new jobs, apartments in big cities, salaries that sounded like impossible numbers. I had nodded along, trying to sound equally accomplished, but inside I was boiling. When one friend asked casually about my dad, I stammered. "He runs a repair shop," I said, and saw the polite nod, the quick change of subject. My shame followed me home like a stray dog. Dad was at the table, balancing his checkbook. He wore glasses that slid down his nose, his brow furrowed in concentration. The lamp cast a yellow glow on his papers. He looked up, smiling. "How was dinner?" I dropped my purse on the counter, louder than necessary. "Fine. Good folks?" he asked. "Yeah," I muttered, pouring water into a glass. My hands shook. I don't know if it was anger or exhaustion, maybe both. He set his pen down. "You seem upset." That was all it took. A small kindness, a gentle observation, and the dam broke. "Upset? Of course I'm upset, Dad. Do you even realize how embarrassing it is? Do you know what it's like to have to explain to people that my father fixes pipes and mows lawns while their dads run companies or argue cases in court?" His eyes widened slightly, as if the words had startled him, though he didn't flinch. He simply folded his hands on the table. "I work hard. I help people. Isn't that enough?" "Enough?" I laughed bitterly. "No, it's not enough. You've wasted your life fixing other people's messes for scraps. You've never built anything for yourself. You've never—" My throat tightened, but pride pushed the words out anyway. "You're a loser, Dad. That's what you are." The word landed like shattering glass. The kitchen went still, as if even the clock had stopped ticking out of respect for the cruelty. His face didn't crumble. He didn't yell. He just looked at me with an expression I will never forget, not anger, not disappointment, but something softer, sadder. A recognition, maybe, that the daughter he had raised with patience and sacrifice now measured him against a ledger he never wanted to keep. He breathed slowly, once, twice, before speaking. "If that's how you see me, Emily, I can't change it." His voice was steady, but his hands trembled as he reached for his papers. He stacked them neatly, aligning the edges as if order could be salvaged from the wreckage of our words. Then he stood. "I'm going to bed." I wanted him to fight back, to defend himself, to prove me wrong. Instead, he left quietly, his footsteps heavy on the old stairs, each creak echoing my guilt. I sat at the table alone, staring at the glass of water I hadn't touched. The word still hung in the air, invisible but sharp, cutting me even as I tried to pretend I felt justified. The next morning, he acted as if nothing had happened. He made coffee, scrambled eggs, asked if I had slept well. I nodded, avoiding his eyes. That was his way, never holding grudges, never adding fuel to the fire. But the silence between us had changed. It was no longer the polite distance of strangers. It was the raw emptiness of a bridge deliberately burned. For the rest of that visit, we barely spoke. I left earlier than planned, citing work obligations. He hugged me at the door, brief and careful, as if unsure of whether I wanted the embrace. "Drive safe," he said. I muttered, "Yeah," and pulled away, not looking back. Years would pass before I saw him again. We texted occasionally, short, shallow messages. "Happy birthday, Em." "Thanks, Dad. Need anything?" "No, I'm fine." Always fine, always surface. The word loser lodged between us like a stone in the throat, never acknowledged, never dislodged. What I didn't know then was that he was still doing what he had always done, helping neighbors, fixing what was broken, giving without asking. What I didn't know was how many lives he was touching in ways that would one day rise up and speak when he no longer could. What I didn't know was that the word I thought defined him would one day define me instead, because nothing haunts you more than realizing you misnamed the person who loved you most. If regret has a calendar, that night will always be circled in red. The night I chose pride over tenderness. The night I traded love for shame. The night I called my father a loser, and he forgave me without ever saying so. Death does not send invitations. It arrives like a phone call in the middle of a Tuesday, when you are busy proving to yourself that you have escaped the gravity of your past. Mine came on an overcast afternoon, in the middle of a meeting where people argued about fonts and color palettes as if they were matters of life and death. My phone buzzed once, twice, and I silenced it. When it buzzed a third time, I stepped into the hallway, exasperated. The voice on the other end was shaky, someone from Asheville I hadn't spoken to in years. "Emily, it's your dad. He's gone." Those words rearranged the world. Walls seemed to lean closer, air turned heavier, sounds collapsed into silence. I remember staring at the carpeted floor, noticing a single strand of thread pulled loose, as if the universe had chosen that moment to show me how fragile everything was. I didn't cry. Not yet. Instead, I thanked the caller mechanically, hung up, and walked back into the meeting. Someone was arguing about margins on a brochure. I sat down, nodded at the right moments, and finished the agenda as though nothing had happened. Grief is strange. It doesn't always knock you down immediately. Sometimes it lets you walk a few more steps before pulling the rug out. That night, alone in my apartment, I finally let the truth pierce me. My father was dead. A heart attack, they said. Sudden. He had been repairing a fence for Mrs. Langley, one of his oldest clients, when he collapsed. She had called 911, but by the time help arrived, it was too late. The image burned itself into me. My father, who had spent a lifetime holding things together, undone by the very heart that made him who he was. I booked a flight to Asheville the next morning. The airport felt unreal, a blur of people dragging suitcases, sipping coffee, talking loudly into phones. I wanted to scream at them, "Don't you know the world has ended?" But of course, the world had ended only for me. That is the cruelty of loss. It is always both personal and indifferent. Flying into the Blue Ridge Mountains, I felt the ache of familiarity. The ridges were the same, steady and ancient, while I had spent years pretending they were too small for me. Now they looked like open arms, and I was too broken to resist them. My cousin picked me up at the airport. We spoke little on the drive. I stared out the window at streets I had once claimed to know by heart. Storefronts had changed, but the town's pulse was the same. It was like returning to a song you had abandoned halfway through, only to find it waiting at the exact note you left. When we pulled into the driveway of my childhood home, everything felt both shrunken and sacred. The porch sagged slightly, the paint peeled, but it was the same house that had held my laughter, my arguments, my word, loser, still echoing faintly in the wood. I half expected Dad to step out in his work boots, wiping his hands on a rag, smiling as if to say, "Hey kiddo, welcome home." But the porch was empty, and the silence pressed on my chest. Inside, the house smelled faintly of lemon oil the way it always had. My father's boots were still by the door, their soles curved to the exact shape of his steps. On the table lay his ledger, a pen resting neatly across it. He had been working even that morning. That detail shattered me more than the announcement of his death. He had been alive only hours ago, doing what he always did, keeping promises, and now he was gone, leaving only half-finished notes and tools still warm from his touch. The funeral was scheduled for Saturday at the town's small church. Word had spread quickly. Asheville is that kind of place. Everyone knows everyone else's business, and in times of loss, that means casseroles arrive before the tears have even dried. Neighbors knocked on our door, bringing food, flowers, and stories. They spoke with reverence, as if my father had been a pillar holding the town upright. At first, I bristled. How could they grieve more deeply than I did? But then I realized they had seen sides of him I had ignored. Their stories were windows, and I had kept mine shuttered for too long. The day of the funeral dawned gray, the sky heavy with clouds that threatened rain but held it back, as if even heaven was reluctant to weep too soon. I dressed carefully, black dress, hair tied neatly, makeup done with trembling hands. Looking at myself in the mirror, I saw a woman polished and put together, a woman who had tried so hard to be impressive. But my eyes gave me away. They were the eyes of a daughter who had failed to see her father. The church was overflowing when I arrived. People stood in the aisles, crowded at the back, even spilled out onto the steps. I froze at the doorway, stunned. My father, who I had considered invisible, had drawn an entire town to tears. As I walked down the aisle, heads turned, faces softened. Some nodded in recognition, others in sympathy. It was as though I were carrying not only my grief, but theirs too. The coffin lay at the front, simple pine, exactly what Dad would have wanted. A carpenter in town had built it by hand. I touched the wood, rough under my fingertips, and whispered, "I'm sorry." My voice cracked, nearly lost under the murmur of the crowd. The service began. Hymns were sung, prayers recited, but what struck me most were the stories. One by one, townspeople stood to speak. A man Dad had helped during a flood. A young woman he had encouraged to finish school. A family whose house he had repaired for free after a fire. Each story painted him not as the loser I had once accused him of being, but as a quiet savior, a man who had stitched lives back together without ever asking for thanks. I sat there, rigid, tears streaming silently. Each word was both balm and blade. Pride had blinded me to this truth. While I had been chasing recognition, my father had been living it, etched not in awards or salaries, but in human hearts. When it was my turn to speak, I stood trembling. The church was silent, every eye on me. My throat tightened. What could I possibly say to atone? I gripped the podium, knuckles white, and finally whispered, "I called my father a loser once." Gasps rippled softly through the room. But looking at all of you, hearing your stories, I realize he was the richest man I'll ever know. My voice cracked, and for the first time since that awful night in the kitchen, I let myself weep openly. The congregation wept with me. It was as though the whole town was forgiving me on his behalf, wrapping me in the love I had refused for so long. After the service, as people lingered, many came to me with embraces, stories, and tears. One elderly man took my hand and said, "Your daddy saved this town more times than I can count. Don't you ever forget that?" I nodded, unable to speak. The weight of regret pressed heavily, but beneath it, a seed of something else stirred, gratitude. That evening, after everyone had gone, I sat alone by the grave. The grass was damp, the air cool. Fireflies blinked in the distance. I spoke softly, as if he could still hear. "I thought you hadn't built anything for yourself, but you built everything for us, and I was too blind to see. Grief is both ending and beginning. That night I felt the first fragile thread of transformation. I had come home expecting emptiness, but I found a town overflowing with proof of my father's quiet greatness. I had called him a loser, but the truth was undeniable. He had lived as a man who saved lives, and in the end, the whole town wept because of it. After the funeral service, people lingered as though leaving would diminish him further, as though the air around the church might still carry pieces of him they could take home. I stood near the steps, numb, hands folded in front of me like I was waiting for permission to breathe. The crowd seemed endless. Every time I thought the flow of faces would slow, another neighbor approached, eyes wet, lips trembling with a story they needed me to hear. At first, I nodded politely, overwhelmed, but soon I realized these stories were not simply condolences. They were confessions, testimonies, fragments of a life I had never bothered to assemble. The first came from Mrs. Langley, the woman in whose yard he had drawn his last breath. She clutched my hands so tightly I felt the pulse in her palms. "Emily," she said, her voice rough with grief, "your father saved me twice. Once when he built that ramp after my hip surgery, refused to take a dime. And again," she paused, tears streaming. "Again when he collapsed fixing my fence. He gave his last strength to help me. Do you understand? He was a blessing to me until his very last moment." I tried to reply, but my throat closed. Her words were both dagger and balm, and I carried them like a stone in my chest. Next was a man I barely recognized, Mr. Alvarez, once a stoic figure who lived down the block. He leaned heavily on a cane now, his shoulders stooped. "Your dad built this for me," he said, lifting the cane slightly, when my hands were too weak after the stroke. "Fashioned it from a piece of oak he kept in the shop. Wouldn't let me pay, said I'd do the same for someone else if I could." He tapped the cane on the ground. "Every step I've taken since then, Emily, has been with his help." His voice cracked, and he shuffled away before I could respond. Then came a young woman, maybe 19, her hair streaked pink, her hands fidgeting nervously. "You don't know me," she said, "but I knew your dad. He used to see me sitting outside the library trying to finish homework when I couldn't concentrate at home. He'd bring me sandwiches, sometimes books he found at yard sales. Told me I was smart, that I could go farther than this town if I wanted to. I'm in college now, first in my family, because of him." She wiped her eyes quickly, embarrassed. "I just thought you should know." One by one they came, stories stacked like bricks, each one reshaping the foundation of the man I thought I knew. A firefighter spoke of how Dad had shown up at a house fire long before the sirens arrived, banging on doors to wake a family asleep inside. "If it weren't for him," the firefighter said solemnly, "we'd have lost them." A mother described how Dad had driven her sick child to the hospital in the middle of the night when her car wouldn't start. "He stayed with me in the waiting room until dawn," she whispered. "Never told a soul." I stood there, rooted, listening as though the world had turned itself inside out. My father, my ordinary, embarrassing father, had been carrying an invisible ledger all along. Not of money, but of mercies, not of profits, but of promises, and every person here seemed to have an entry in it. As the crowd thinned, I found myself sitting on the church steps, staring at my hands. They looked so clean, so unmarked compared to his. He had worn his body down like a tool, every scar and callus a receipt for something fixed, someone helped. I had spent years filing my nails, polishing resumes, collecting titles. And yet, in this town, in this moment, it was his hands that had built monuments invisible but enduring. Later that evening, at the reception in the church hall, more stories poured in, carried on the scent of casseroles and coffee. A boy no older than 12 told me Dad had helped him build his first bike from spare parts, teaching him how to balance and pedal. A widow recalled Dad spending Christmas Eve repairing her furnace so her grandchildren wouldn't sleep cold. A shopkeeper said Dad once slipped money into the till when he saw her crying over a shortfall, and when she confronted him later, he simply shrugged. Must have miscounted when I paid for the screws. Each tale was a twist of the knife inside me, but also a salve. I had called him a loser, believing he had built nothing, achieved nothing. But here was the evidence that he had built everything that mattered. Not skyscrapers or companies, but lives. Not legacies written in history books, but in beating hearts. At one point, I stepped outside, overwhelmed by the tide of voices. The evening air was cool, cicadas humming in the trees. I leaned against the brick wall, trying to steady myself. That's when Pastor Graham approached, his eyes kind. "You know, Emily," he said gently, "your father had a way of making people believe they mattered. That's rarer than any title or fortune. This town is grieving because we've lost more than a handyman. We've lost our anchor." Anchor, the word lodged in me. I had mistaken him for dead weight all those years, thinking he kept me from rising. But he had been the anchor that steadied not just me, but everyone around him. And without him, I wondered how many of us would drift aimlessly. That night, lying awake in my old room, I tried to reconcile the two versions of my father, the one I had accused of failure and the one the town remembered as savior. Memories replayed with new clarity. The nights he came home late, the envelopes he slid into church donation boxes, the quiet way he brushed off praise. They were no longer small acts. They were clues I had ignored, signs of a man whose wealth could never be measured in dollars. Tears came in waves, not just for his absence, but for my blindness. I had spent years crafting an image of success, while he had been quietly successful all along in the only currency that lasts: love given, burdens lifted, lives saved. The twist wasn't simply that he had done these things in secret. The twist was that I had been too busy chasing applause to hear the ovation already surrounding him. The following day, more letters and stories arrived. People slipped notes into our mailbox, thank yous, memories, testimonies. One read, "Robert fixed our roof after the storm. We didn't have money, so he asked us to bake him a pie instead. We still make that pie every year in his honor." Another, "He mowed my lawn every week the summer I was battling cancer. When I tried to pay him, he said the grass grows for free, so should kindness." I gathered them into a box, trembling as I realized this was his true legacy. Not the tools in his shop or the money in his account, but the endless ripples of kindness he had set in motion. I once called my father a loser, but sitting there, surrounded by testimonies of lives he had quietly saved, I understood the truth. He had been winning all along, just not on the scoreboard I had been taught to revere. His victories were invisible, unheralded, yet undeniable. And now, in his absence, the town itself was his monument, every tear shed proof that greatness can be built in silence. Grief, I've learned, is not just sorrow for the person you lose. It is sorrow for the person you failed to see when they were right in front of you. After the funeral, after the endless tide of stories, I wandered through my father's house like an intruder in a museum dedicated to a man I had never properly met. Every room whispered reminders. Every object carried a weight I had never noticed. In the living room, the recliner still leaned slightly to the left, the way his body always had when he sank into it after a long day. I used to mock that chair, call it ugly, outdated. Now I stood before it like it was a relic, wholly simply because it had held him. I ran my hand over the fabric, worn smooth by years of his presence, and felt tears threaten again. It was just a chair, but it was also a ledger, silently recording all the evenings he chose to stay home rather than go out, to be near me rather than anywhere else. The kitchen table was worse. Every groove and scratch replayed our history. That was where he taught me fractions with slices of pie. That was where I did homework while he fixed a toaster beside me. That was where, years later, I had hurled the word loser at him. I pressed my palms against its surface now, as though I could erase the sound of my voice embedded in the wood. In his bedroom, I found his closet meticulously neat. Boots lined like soldiers, shirts folded with the kind of precision you'd expect from someone who believed dignity began with order. Above the shelf sat the old coffee tin marked tires. I lifted it down, heavy in my hands. Inside, folded bills. Not many, but enough to suggest he had been saving steadily. The tears came hot and fast. All those years I thought he was careless with money, running a failing business. He had been saving, not for himself, but for me, for emergencies, for whatever came. I remembered how he had pressed 20s into my palm, saying, sometimes it's about who gives, not what. He had been giving even when I thought he had nothing left. The shop was hardest of all. I unlocked the door with trembling hands, the bell above jingling the same tired chime as in my childhood. Everything smelled of oil and wood and the faint sweetness of sawdust. Tools hung neatly on the wall, each in its place. Index cards littered the workbench, reminders of jobs, notes about neighbors. One read, fix misses, Jensen's porch, don't charge until next month, chemo bills. Another, check on Alvarez, ask about his cane. His handwriting was steady, patient. These weren't just tasks, they were testimonies of a man who kept promises not because he had to, but because he believed that's what people owed one another. I sat at his workbench, my fingers tracing the indentations left by years of hammer strikes. For the first time, I let the silence fill me, not rushing to push it away with work or excuses. And in that silence, memory returned, clearer than before. I remembered nights when he came home late, his clothes damp from rain. I used to think he wasted his time helping neighbors with small repairs. But now I saw the truth. Those nights were stories I never asked to hear. Each late return meant someone's roof didn't leak, someone's window closed properly, someone's child slept warm. I remembered Christmas mornings when gifts were modest, scarves, books, second-hand trinkets. I used to envy friends who boasted of new bikes and gadgets, but now I remembered the way his eyes lit up as I unwrapped even the smallest thing. He gave me not the flashiest gifts, but the certainty that I was loved, and I had thrown that certainty back at him, calling it not enough. I remembered the day my mother left. He never spoke ill of her. Not once. He simply filled the gaps she left with quiet stability, making breakfast, folding laundry, asking about my day. I mistook his silence for weakness. Now I realized it was strength. Restraint takes more muscle than anger ever will. Piece by piece, the puzzle reassembled itself. The man I had belittled for not building a legacy had been building one all along, just not the kind I had been trained to recognize. He had built trust. He had built community. He had built me, even when I pushed against his hands. The guilt was suffocating. At night, lying in my childhood bed, I replayed the moment I called him a loser, over and over, his face steady but wounded, his hands trembling as he stacked papers, his quiet exit up the stairs. I had wanted him to defend himself, to shout, to prove me wrong, but he hadn't. He had let me have the last word, not because I was right, but because he loved me too much to fight. And that was the cruelty of it. He had forgiven me before I had even asked. Now he was gone, and I would never hear him say the words. Forgiveness without witness is both gift and punishment. I tried to write him a letter, though I knew it was too late. I sat at the kitchen table, pen shaking in my hand, and began, "Dad, I'm sorry," but the words were inadequate. How do you apologize for years of blindness, for mistaking kindness for failure, for confusing humility with defeat? The page blurred with tears. I folded it, placed it under the coffee tin, as though he might find it somehow. Days turned into weeks. I stayed in Asheville longer than planned, sorting his affairs, but really sorting my own heart. People kept coming by with more stories. Each one was a mirror reflecting the truth I had ignored. With every story, my shame deepened, but so did my gratitude. The town had seen my father. They had loved him, valued him, learned from him. In their eyes, he was not a loser, but a hero. Slowly, something shifted. The guilt remained, but alongside it grew resolve. If I could not thank him, perhaps I could live differently. Perhaps I could carry forward what he had taught, even if I had refused to learn it when he was alive. One evening, I found myself sitting on the porch, watching the sunset spill gold across the hills. For the first time, I felt the weight of stillness the way he must have. It wasn't emptiness. It was fullness too quiet for the untrained ear. I whispered into the fading light, "I see you now, Dad. I finally see." The transformation wasn't sudden. It was gradual, like dawn inching across the sky. But the recognition was there. I had called him a loser because I measured him by the wrong scale. And now, in his absence, I understood. The true measure of a man is not what he earns, but what he gives. Not what he owns, but what he leaves behind in others. In those weeks after his death, I began to change. I slowed down. I noticed things I had ignored. The sound of cicadas, the way neighbors checked on one another, the beauty of work done quietly, faithfully. It was as if my father's lens had been fitted over my eyes. The town looked different. The world looked different. I looked different. And yet, beneath the transformation, the guilt persisted. Could I ever forgive myself for the word that had defined our last chapter together? I didn't know. But I knew this. His life had not been wasted. Mine had, in all the years I refused to see him. What I once dismissed as weakness, I now revered as wisdom. What I once called failure, I now recognized as faith. My father had been the kind of man the world underestimates, the kind of man you only understand when it's too late. And I had been the kind of daughter who mistook mirrors for windows, pride for progress. But even in death, he was teaching me that forgiveness can begin even when it cannot be spoken, teaching me that love is not diminished by blindness. It waits, patient, until eyes finally open, teaching me that a loser in the world's eyes can be the greatest winner of all. The hardest part of telling a story is knowing it has no sequel. My father's life ended with no more chapters to write, no more chances for me to take back words I should never have said. But in another sense, his story keeps unfolding, through the people he helped, through the town he steadied, and through me, the daughter finally learning what it means to measure a man. I sit now on the same porch where he used to sip coffee at dawn, staring at the mountains that cradle this town. For years, I thought these hills too small for ambition, too ordinary to matter. Now I see them as he must have, steady, patient, enduring. They remind me of him. Ordinary, yes, but only if you mistake quiet strength for weakness. Extraordinary if you look with the right eyes. The lesson my father left me is simple, but it took me half a lifetime to understand. Success is not what the world applauds, but what the heart sustains. A paycheck fades, applause dies, titles gather dust. But the roof you fix for a neighbor, the meal you share with the hungry, the hand you extend to the weary, those are the things that echo long after you're gone. I once called him a loser. I let that word define him in my mind, and in doing so, I nearly erased the truth. But the town remembered. The town wept. They carried stories I never asked for, stories that saved me when I thought redemption was impossible. And in their tears, I found my father again. So here is my vow. I will carry his legacy. I will choose kindness when it is easier to look away. I will measure worth not in numbers, but in the lives touched along the way. And if anyone ever calls me my father's daughter, I will smile and say, "Thank you." To those of you who have listened to this story, thank you. Thank you for walking with me through grief, regret, and the fragile beauty of redemption. My wish for you is simple, the wish my father would have given. May you find health. May your family know love. May your home be filled with peace. And if you see someone who needs a hand, may you offer it quietly, faithfully, the way he always did. If this story touched you, I invite you to stay with us. There are more stories about fathers, about families, about the hidden lives that shape us. Consider subscribing, not just to this channel, but to the idea that stories like these matter. That remembering matters. That love, even when spoken too late, can still change us. From my heart to yours, thank you for listening. Take care of yourself and of those you love, and may you never miss the quiet greatness sitting right across the table.